Friends, today we are going to talk about an important theoretical framework in international relations by the name of constructivism. Some scholars by the name of Nicholas Unoff, Peter Katzenstein, and Alexander Wendt were the IR pioneers of constructivism. By the end of the 1990s, it was quite clear that Europe was the place, and to some extent even the United States, that had come to embrace the ideas of these scholars who were different in their approach from the rationalist scholars of the earlier times. Onuff's work was to a large extent the precursor of what was to become a much more accentuated trend in the post-Cold War world of international relations. It was understood that the rationalist approaches had quite failed to predict the outcome of the bipolar confrontation. In the words of Wendt, it caught scholars on both sides off guard and also left the established orthodoxies in international relations quite exposed. How were two countries who were locked in an intense competition, an arms race over 4 decades, were now effectively partners in a new world order? It was something, which was very baffling. Because according to the realist framework, these two countries, that is America and the Soviet Union, should have been fighting continuously or should have been competing continuously in their arms race. And there was no logic that they would change course and become practically, with each other partners in a new world, order which was there at that point of time. Few rationalist approaches could explain such a drastic change, or rather even they could not anticipate what was coming in the international arena. Here, the constructivists argued that international relations was to a large extent the result of social interactions and the patterns of sociability. So they are here trying to shift the focus of IR research and trying to focus on these social interactions and ideas which according to them were basic in determining the actions and foreign policies which countries took in the international political arena. Constructivism emerged actually as a via media, advocating a distinct kind of ontology which depicted the social world as intersubjective and collectively meaningful, and its structures and processes. It also opened spaces for all kinds of methodological and epistemological approaches. It was at the same time compatible with rationalism to some extent, quantitative methods, and most other forms of qualitative analysis. Actually, for them, what is a social construction and what happens in the international political arena, it is all the consequence of social interactions. So therefore, if we were to speak of an objective world, we are wrong. Or for that matter, even if we speak of objective social relations, because according to the constructivist scholars, these are the products of intersubjective knowledge of facts. Meaning is actually established by the interaction of subjects. So, subjects per se do not carry much of a meaning. But when they interact with each other, that interaction leads to the creation of meaning. So therefore, understandings are not purely individual and subjective, but shared and contextually determined. So therefore, constructivism puts IR in this broader construct of social relations. They actually assume that complex culture shapes state behavior regarding international security and military force. For example, if a state is asked to mediate a conflict between two states, it might acquire an identity as a peacemaker or mediator. And with that new identity will come an interest in acting as a peacemaker. So, in the times to come, that particular country might realize that this new identity which it has acquired might be more meaningful for us, might be more useful for it in the times to come. And therefore, it has an interest in acting as a peacemaker. Examples are countries like Norway, who in today's world, if one were to look at them from the perspective of hard power, they would probably be not counted, in those stakes. But they have acquired a very significant identity as peacemaker, and therefore, with this identity have come new interests, and therefore they see that they have acquired a considerable amount of weight in international political arena because of this new identity. So discourses, practices, and actions have sedimented meanings that can change over time, but those meanings are temporarily stable, meaning thereby that those meanings are not permanently established. They are temporary, they are transient, and with times, with new kinds of interactions, new kinds of practices, they might eventually change. As a result, structures are not deterministic features of everyday life, but rather limiting and temporary boundary setting. And they are formed from the stabilization of certain meanings, as a result of these interactions. So therefore, structures open the way for a particular agent's autonomous decision making, which can lead in turn to the change of the structure. So that decision making by that structure, by that agent, which is autonomous, can in due course lead to the change in the structure itself. So therefore, a structure is something which is not fixed, it changes with time. In a sense, the structure is not seen as the strong barrier or the definer that defines how the world politics interacts, but rather as a mediator between human agency and social dynamics. So therefore, this is where constructivists are trying to give a new meaning to structures, and how the structures can eventually turn out to be transient, and how new meaning can be given to those structures which some time back were considered to be final, but eventually, as a result of new interactions, they acquire new meanings and shapes. According to a scholar named Ted Hoff, there are 5 main features which could define constructivism for us. He argues that the actors and structures in the international system are mutually constituted through the media of norms and practices. And in the absence of norms, they exercise power or actions which would be devoid of any kind of meaning. So therefore, if those norms are not there, their actions do not hold any significant meaning. Secondly, as a result of the anarchy, in the international system, which we assume as realists is something, which is final and immutable, they say that it has no material existence. Actually, it is only a social fact. And then they argue, or Ted Hoff argues, that identities and interests are interrelated in world politics. The interests of actors reflect identity construction. And these identity constructs are essential in order to ensure at least some minimum level of predictability and order in the international system. Fourthly, Ted Hoff argues that practices are fundamental to understanding international relations. Why? It is due to their capacity to reproduce the intersubjective meanings that constitute social structures and actors alike. So the importance here is on intersubjective meanings. When actors interact with each other, in that interaction or as a consequence of that interaction, new intersubjective meanings are produced. Finally, through social practice, it also becomes clear that change in world politics is possible. As social practices change, so therefore, consequently, changes also can come in world politics, although he concedes that it is something which is difficult, it is not so easy, but it is something which is in the realm of possibility. So it might happen. Alexander Wendt actually elaborated on these points. He is one of the most prominent scholars in the field of social constructivism, and in his now very famous writing, which is entitled Anarchy is What States Make of It. The title itself is self-speaking. Here the title itself is challenging the existing maxim of realism, where they say that anarchy is something which is basic to the structure of international politics. And here he is arguing in the title itself that anarchy is what states make of it, meaning thereby that states create anarchy. Anarchy is not a given in international politics. It is the behavior as the states behave that might lead to the creation of anarchy. And because they have a certain mindset which has been firmed up, as a result of our fixation with realism, that leads us to act in a certain manner because we are guided by those fixed ideas, and eventually anarchy is created in international politics. So anarchy is the consequence of how states would be acting in the international political arena. Nevertheless, Alexander Wendt then later on in 1999, his very celebrated work came out by the title Social Theory of International Politics. And here he came up with an alternative reading of the world in which we live. And here his aim was to build a bridge between the two traditions here by developing a constructivist argument. So Wendt concluded that the anarchy in the international system and the distribution of power were insufficient factors to explain how international relations worked or operated. And he said that neorealism had failed to consider in sufficient depth what was the fourth critical element in international relations, and that he called as ideas. So for him, ideas were extremely important to understand international relations and how states behaved and acted through their foreign policies in the international arena. In his view, the ideational structures shaped the way actors define themselves through the process of socialization. So the process of socialization which operates within a country among people, and that process of socialization as regards individuals is a process through which we do the social learning. It is a process which we start when we are born in this world, and it does not even end. It ends for us with our death. But here we learn things about the society, about our culture, about our political culture, and it is something which is inadvertent, means we are not making any efforts to learn, but those ideas are conditioning our behavior in the public sphere. Similarly, here he is arguing that these ideational structures and the socialization among countries of the world would determine how they would act in international politics. So, maybe it is not something which is very deliberate on the part of the states, but this interaction with other states would give them certain rather ideas, and as a consequence of that, they would be acting accordingly. Wendt would claim that ideational structures and actors co-constitute and co-determine each other. So there is a relationship of reciprocity between the structures and the actors. Therefore, he argues, as I just now mentioned to you, that anarchy only exists if states believe it does. So if we believe anarchy exists, there will be anarchy and we will be acting accordingly. It is through ideas that states ultimately relate with each other. So therefore, he concludes that self-help and power politics as advocated by the realist school of thought are institutions and not essential features of anarchy. We create these institutions and then act accordingly. And once we are acting in that manner, we in the realist school of thought tend to believe that these structures are timeless and immutable and we can't escape these structures because they are permanent and fixed. This is a notion which has been challenged by Alexander Wendt and other scholars in this school of thought of constructivism. Now, some people might think, by looking at the explanations which we have been discussing as yet in constructivism, that it is something which is totally different from what neorealists had argued. But as we have mentioned earlier also, that this explanation of constructivists is an attempt to create a bridge and try to see that different schools of thought in international politics are coming together and looking at each other not as competitors but as fulfillers. That one perspective from this side fulfills the other perspective from the other side and vice versa. So therefore, Wendt's constructivism does not entirely reject neorealism. It requires the acceptance of states as central actors in the international system, endowed with certain features. Number one, an institutional legal order. Number two, an organization claiming a monopoly on the legitimate use of organized violence, which states play the role. Thirdly, an organization with sovereignty. Fourthly, a society. And finally, a territory. So therefore, Wendt concludes that states are therefore still at the core of international relations. Any systemic change at the international level has to come only through these states. To emphasize this point further, Wendt argues that states are as central to international politics as trees are to forests. So as you cannot talk about a forest without talking about the trees, similarly you cannot talk about international politics without talking about the states, who are the primary constituents of international politics. So it is here that Wendt is quite close to the neorealists and their assumptions about states being the primary actors in international politics. However, there are some arguments which allow Wendt to distance himself from realism and sustain the uniqueness of constructivism. And therefore, he comes on to identify three key problems with realism. Number one, he argues that realism cannot explain structural change. It cannot explain why states change their behavior or why the international system went from bipolarity to unipolarity at the end of the Cold War. Giving an example of the Soviet Union, he argues that Gorbachev had the courage to see that it was their own practices or the Soviet Union's own practices that sustained the Cold War. And he was able to do a reassessment of Western institutions, which were always considered as evil or rather very dominating and intrusive by the Soviet Union. But once the Soviets, under the leadership of Gorbachev, were able to change their perceptions, things started changing. He argues that realists would not pay much attention to such social factors. But if you look at the way things change in international politics after the end of the Cold War, you would find that the realists do not have a real explanation to this change, because as per their explanations, such a change should not have come about, and Soviet Union had no reason to change its perception vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis the Western institutions and vis-a-vis its participation in the endless arms race with the United States of America. Next, Wendt argues that new realism as a theory is too general, and the scope of analysis is so broad and the temporal frame is so large that it is difficult to understand what they are basically trying to argue. For example, he says that what can constitute a balancing act in international politics is something, which neorealism would not be able to specifically pinpoint. For any specific change in the system that falsifies their theory, a neorealist can always say that it is too early to say or too early to conclude that this is something which has happened. So therefore, since the canvas is so broad, so they have many points from where they can escape, once cornered theoretically. And that is something, which is problematic for Alexander Wendt, because he says that such a theory which has such generalized kinds of broad explanations is something which is not very useful in understanding how things happen in the international political arena. So he has problems with this general and rather omnibus nature of the framework of realists. Finally, he argues that even if we were to take the assumptions of realists or neorealists at face value, state behavior could still not be explained by the anarchical structure of the system. He argues that states balance in the international system not because of the structure, that the structure is anarchical, but because they want to survive. So he emphasizes that it is security rather than anarchy, or the concern for security rather than anarchy, that defines the self-help behavior of state actors. The problem is that self-help is not a constant fear of state behavior. He says that sometimes states could be egoists and other times they may be not. The behavior of states is quite similar to human beings here. Human beings also, sometimes could be very egoist and sometimes they may be not. And this change in the nature of the state, can change the logic of anarchy. Therefore, Wendt argues that the process resulting from state interaction might lead to an anarchical system, and it is not the other way around. So this interaction, this process of interaction among states might lead to a situation of anarchy. So the realists claim that it is the other way around is something which is negated by Alexander Wendt, and he has these basic three problems with the explanations of the realists. So therefore, Wendt argues that the self of an actor is the result of an actor's socialization with other actors. Identities actually are the basis of interests, and actors do not have a portfolio of interests that they can carry around independent of the social context. Instead, they define their interest in the process of defining situations. So these interests of states are not fixed, They would change as the social context changes. And therefore, we have to understand the interests of state actors in this perspective. And therefore, these conclusions of Alexander Wendt actually put him quite apart from what were the explanations of the neorealists as far as the international political system is concerned. So these are some of the basic arguments which were given by Alexander Wendt, who, as I mentioned, was one of the most prominent constructivist thinkers. And there are some other explanations which this theory of constructivism comes with. We will deal with those explanations in the next segment of our lecture. So thank you.